"Get away from my trash cans, you filthy little rat. I don't feed vermin now, scram, before I call the sheriff on you." The words hit Nate Hargrove harder than the cold ever could. He froze behind the diner on Route 9, one hand still buried in a garbage bag, fingers wrapped around a half-eaten roll someone had thrown away that morning. The man in the stained apron stood in the kitchen doorway, cigarette smoke curling around his scowl, disgust written plainly across his face, the kind of disgust reserved for something less than human. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. Nate didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He dropped the roll back into the bag, straightened his thin jacket over shoulders that had grown too sharp, too visible beneath the fabric, and walked away without looking back. Behind him, the cook spat onto the gravel and slammed the door shut, and the sound of it echoed down the alley long after Nate had turned the corner. He was 16 years old, and he had learned in the space of only a few months exactly how little the world thought he was worth. The town was called Millbrook, a fading industrial stretch of eastern Ohio where the steel plant had closed years earlier and never reopened, leaving behind boarded storefronts and men who drank away what little was left of their pride. Nate's father had been one of them. The house Nate grew up in had once smelled of his mother's cooking. After she passed, it smelled only of whiskey and silence. And then, on a night Nate never spoke of, afterward it smelled of something else entirely: fear. Sharp and metallic, filling every room until he simply stopped being able to breathe inside those walls. He left with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a canvas duffel bag that held one extra shirt, a photograph of his mother with the corner torn off, and $41 he'd saved from mowing lawns the summer before. That had been 3 months ago. The $41 were long gone. Winter in Millbrook did not forgive. Nate slept most nights in the loading bay behind the old cannery, wedged between stacked pallets where the wind couldn't quite reach him, though it always found a way, and eventually thin, cruel fingers of cold slipping through the gaps in his jacket, through the newspaper he stuffed inside his shoes where the soles had worn through. He had stopped shivering weeks ago. His body had simply given up fighting it, and some nights he lay awake wondering, with a strange and frightening calm, whether that was a good sign or a very bad one. He was hungry in a way that changed a person. Not the hunger of skipping a meal, but the hollow, gnawing kind that hollowed out his thoughts, along with his stomach, that made him dizzy when he stood too quickly, that made the whole world tilt sideways if he went too long without eating. His ribs had become visible beneath his shirt. His hands, when he held them up in the gray morning light, had begun to shake, not from cold alone, but from something deeper. Something his body was quietly starving out of him, and still he was careful. He never took more than he needed. He never begged outright, because begging meant looking someone in the eye and admitting what he had become, and some nights that felt harder to survive than the cold itself. He wandered for a long while after the diner on Route 9 turned him away, his sneakers scraping against frost-hardened gravel, his breath fogging in front of him in short, uneven bursts. The streetlights of Millbrook's Main Street flickered on one by one as the sky darkened, and Nate kept his head down, kept his eyes on the pavement the way he had learned to move through the world, now small, quiet, unnoticed, because being noticed had only ever brought him trouble. That was when he saw it. A small diner on the corner of 5th and Elm, its neon sign missing a letter, so that it read, Bennett's Dinner, warm yellow light spilling out onto the sidewalk through a window fogged with kitchen steam. The smell reached him before anything else did: coffee bacon, something sweet baking in an oven, and his stomach twisted so violently that he had to stop walking and press a hand against the brick wall beside him just to stay upright. He stood there a long moment, torn between two feelings that felt in that instant like they might tear him in half. Hunger pulled him toward the door. Fear held him back. He had already been called vermin once that night. He did not know if he could survive hearing it again. Through the window he watched a woman moving between the counter and the kitchen, gray-streaked hair pulled back, an apron dusted with flour, moving with the easy, tired rhythm of someone who had run that diner for a very long time. She laughed at something a customer said. She refilled a coffee cup without being asked. There was nothing remarkable about her, and yet Nate found himself watching her the way a drowning man watches a distant shore. He almost turned away. His hand had already found the strap of his duffel bag, already begun to pull him back into the dark. But his body betrayed him. A gust of wind cut straight through his jacket and he flinched. And in that small, involuntary movement, he stumbled half a step forward, close enough that the woman inside glanced up and caught his reflection in the glass. Their eyes met for only a second. Nate's whole body went rigid, braced for the shout, the same disgust, the same word vermin waiting to be hurled at him through the glass. It never came. The woman set down the coffee pot she was holding, wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask why a boy his age was standing alone on a street corner after dark in the middle of winter with hollow cheeks and trembling hands. She simply held the door open and said in a voice so plain and unbothered, it almost didn't register as kindness at all. Well, don't just stand there letting the heat out. Come sit down before you catch your death. Nate did not move at first. Something in his chest had locked up entirely, some old and battered instinct screaming at him that kindness was a trick, that the door would slam the moment he stepped through it, that this was simply a different, crueler version of the same lesson the cook on Route 9 had already taught him once. That night. But the woman waited. She didn't rush him. She didn't reach for him, didn't tower over him the way adults sometimes did when they wanted something from you. She just stood there holding the door, patient as the cold itself, until finally Nate's legs carried him forward on their own, one uncertain step at a time across the threshold and into the warmth. She sat him at the far end of the counter away from the other customers and without a word set down a plate of eggs and toast and a mug of hot coffee thick with sugar. When he tried in a voice barely above a whisper to explain that he had no money, she waved the words away before he could finish them. Eat first, she said. Talk later. Or don't talk at all if that's easier. He ate like a boy who had forgotten somewhere along the way that eating could be anything other than survival. And somewhere between the first bite and the last, sitting in the glow of that diner while the wind howled uselessly against the windows outside, something in Nate Hargrove, some small, stubborn part of him that had not yet frozen over, completely began very quietly to believe that the world might still hold a place for him after all. He did not know her name that first night. He would not learn it for weeks, but he would remember for the rest of his life the exact sound of her voice, the exact weight of that plate sliding across the counter toward him, and the strange, aching gratitude of being fed by someone who had asked for nothing in return. Her name was Ruth Bennett, and Nate did not learn it until the third week. He came back the following night, not because he expected the kindness to repeat itself, but because some fragile, disbelieving part of him needed to know whether it had been real at all, whether a woman could truly hand a stranger a hot plate of food and ask for nothing, or whether the world simply hadn't gotten around to collecting its debt yet. He stood outside the fogged window of Bennett's diner for nearly 10 minutes before he worked up the nerve to go in, half convinced she wouldn't remember him, half convinced she would remember him and regret it. She looked up from behind the counter, saw him standing awkwardly by the door, and simply nodded toward the same stool at the far end as though he'd never left. You're late, she said, though he had never told her when to come, and there was something in the dry, matter-of-fact way she said it that made his chest ache in a way hunger never had. He didn't cry that night, though. He came close. He had learned somewhere in the months since leaving his father's house that crying accomplished nothing except drawing attention, and attention was the one thing he could not afford. So instead, he simply ate and said thank you, in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air, and Ruth Bennett accepted it the way she accepted everything, without ceremony, without pity, without making him feel smaller than he already felt. It became without either of them ever naming it an arrangement. Nate would appear near closing when the dinner crowd had thinned and the diner sat mostly empty, and Ruth would find some task that needed doing, sweeping the back room, hauling crates from the delivery truck, scraping gum from beneath the counter stools, and pay him in food instead of money, because food, she told him once, couldn't be stolen from him by someone bigger the way cash could. He never asked how she knew that. He suspected from the careful way she said it that she knew it from experience of her own. Weeks folded into one another. The worst of winter began at last to loosen its grip, though the nights remained bitter enough that Nate still slept wrapped in whatever he could find, still woke some mornings with his jaw clenched tight from shivering in his sleep. But something had changed in him that he could not quite name. For the first time since he'd left home, he had somewhere to be, a place that expected him, a woman who, without ever once asking why a boy his age was alone in the world, had simply decided he was worth feeding. One evening, mid-March, the wind still sharp but the worst of the frost finally breaking, Ruth caught him staring too long at a help-wanted sign taped inside the window of the hardware store 2 doors down. She said nothing about it that night. But the following morning when Nate arrived to sweep the storeroom, she was waiting for him with a clean shirt, a little large in the shoulders, but clean, and a folded slip of paper with a name and an address written on it in careful cursive. "Man who owns the hardware store owes me a favor or two," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. The closest thing to embarrassment Nate had ever seen cross her face. "Told him you're reliable. Don't make a liar out of me." Nate stood there holding the paper as though it might dissolve if he gripped it too hard. He did not have words for what he felt in that moment, something too large and too unfamiliar to fit inside the small, careful shape he'd learned to keep his emotions in. He managed finally only a whisper. "Why are you doing this for me?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, wiping down a counter that did not need wiping. "Because somebody did it for me once," she said. "Long time ago. Didn't ask why either." She looked at him then, and something passed between them that neither of them tried to put into words, an understanding, wordless and complete, of two people who had both at some point been handed a kindness they hadn't earned and never forgot it. The job at the hardware store gave Nate something he had not had in a very long time: a schedule, a purpose, a reason to wake before the cold had fully settled into his bones. He swept floors, stocked shelves, hauled bags of concrete mix that made his thin arms burn, and slowly, over the weeks that followed, began to fill out with something resembling strength. He was paid honestly and on time, and he saved every dollar he could, hiding it inside the lining of his duffel bag, refusing to let himself imagine what it might someday add up to, because imagining felt dangerous, felt like tempting a world that had already shown him exactly how quickly it could take things away. He should have known better than to let himself hope. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the store crowded with customers stocking up for the coming spring. A boy near Nate's own age wandered in with two friends, well-dressed in a way that made Nate acutely, painfully aware of the second-hand shirt on his own back. Derek Whitmore, son of the man who owned the machine shop on the other side of town, the kind of boy who had never once in his life wondered where his next meal would come from. Derek and his friends drifted through the aisles, loud and careless, and at some point, purely for the entertainment of it, Derek slipped a small brass hinge into his coat pocket and walked toward the door laughing. Nate saw it happen. He said nothing, it wasn't his place, he told himself, and confronting a boy like Derek Whitmore in front of his friends felt like exactly the kind of trouble he could not afford. But the store owner, sharp-eyed and already suspicious of theft that month, caught the movement in the corner of his vision and demanded to know who was responsible. And Derek, without a flicker of hesitation, without so much as a pause to consider the weight of what he was about to do, turned and pointed directly at Nate. It was him, he said, his voice smooth and certain, the voice of a boy who had never once in his life been disbelieved. "I saw him take something off the shelf and put it in his bag. Ask anybody you know his kind. He doesn't even have a real home." The words landed on Nate like a physical blow. For one long suspended moment, the entire store seemed to hold its breath around him, the customers turning, the store owner's face hardening, Derek's two friends nodding along with practiced ease, as though the accusation required no proof at all beyond the simple fact of who Nate was and who Derek was. Nate opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. He had learned in the months since leaving home exactly how little his word was worth against someone else's, and standing there in that aisle, surrounded by shelves of nails and rope and paint cans, he understood with a sudden sickening clarity that no explanation he offered would matter. Not against a boy whose family had money. Not against a boy whose father golfed with the sheriff on Sundays. He was let go that same afternoon, the store owner's apologetic but final words barely registering through the roaring in his ears. "Can't have people thinking we tolerate that kind of thing, son, you understand." He did not correct him. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded, collected the wages owed to him in silence, and walked out into the gray afternoon light with his chest hollowed out by something far worse than hunger. He did not go to the diner that evening. He could not bear the thought of Ruth Bennett's face when she learned that the boy she had vouched for, the boy whose reliability she had promised on her own name, had been fired for theft he never committed. He sat instead behind the old cannery in the same loading bay, where he'd slept those first bitter weeks, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Nate allowed himself in the deepening dark to cry, not from the cold this time, but from the quiet, devastating realization settling into him like a stone that some people would always be believed and some people, no matter how honest, how careful, how good, would always be disbelieved simply for being poor. He did not yet know the name Derek Whitmore would go on to make for himself. He did not know that the boy's easy, careless cruelty that afternoon was only the first of many lessons the world still had waiting for him. He knew only that something inside him had closed a little tighter that night, A door quietly shutting, a wall quietly rising, brick by brick, around a heart that had already been asked to survive far more than any 16-year-old should ever have to carry alone. He did not go back to the diner for 4 days. It was the longest Nate Hargrove had stayed away since the night Ruth Bennett first held the door open for him, and every hour of those 4 days felt like a small, private punishment proof. He told himself that he had been right all along, not to let himself hope for anything more than survival. He picked up what work he could find, hauling scrap at the rail yard for men who paid in crumpled bills and didn't ask questions, shoveling the last stubborn patches of late winter snow from sidewalks for $1 here, 50 cents there. He slept behind the cannery again, the loading bay colder now that he'd grown, used to something better, and some nights he lay awake, staring at the rafters above him, replaying Derek Whitmore's voice in his head. He doesn't even have a real home until the words wore a groove into him. He could not quite smooth back out. On the 5th evening, hunger finally overruled pride, and Nate found himself standing once again outside the fogged window of Bennett's diner, watching the warm yellow light spill out onto the wet pavement, torn between the ache in his stomach and the shame sitting heavier in his chest. Ruth saw him before he could decide whether to knock. She came around the counter so quickly that the bell above the door was still swinging. When she reached him, her hands finding his shoulders, her eyes moving over him with a sharpness that missed nothing, the hollows beneath his eyes deeper than before, the tremor in his hands worse. "Where have you been?" she demanded, and there was something in her voice Nate had never heard directed at him before. Not anger exactly, but something close to fear. The particular fear of someone who has already lost people and cannot bear the thought of losing one more. He told her, standing there in the doorway with the cold still clinging to his jacket. He told her everything, the hinge in Derek Whitmore's pocket, the easy certainty in the boy's voice, as he pointed the store owner's apologetic finality, the 4 nights behind the cannery spent too ashamed to face her. His voice shook through most of it, not from cold this time, and by the end, he could not meet her eyes at all, certain that whatever warmth had existed between them would curdle now into the same disappointment he'd seen on every adult face since leaving his father's house. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Nate's stomach twisted with the certainty that he had finally at last exhausted whatever grace she had to give him. Then she took off her apron, hung it on the hook by the door, and said, "Get your coat. We're going to see Warren Kessler right now, and you're going to tell him exactly what you just told me." "He won't believe me," Nate said, the words scraping out of him raw and small. "Nobody believes me. That's just how it works." Ruth stopped with her hand on the door and turned to look at him fully, and something in her expression made the whole diner seem to go quiet around them, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of customers fading into the background of Nate's awareness until there was only her face and the fierce, unshakable certainty written across it. "It doesn't matter whether he believes you," she said. "It matters that somebody stood next to you and said it out loud anyway. You remember that, Nathan? A person can survive an awful lot of not being believed so long as they've got one person in the room who never once doubted them." He did not have an answer for that. He simply nodded, wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, and followed her out into the cold. Warren Kessler did not give Nate his job back that night. The hardware store had already hired someone else, a nephew of the sheriff's, and no amount of Ruth Bennett's insistence could undo that. But something shifted in the town regardless, some small crack of doubt opening in the story Derek Whitmore had told so easily. Word moved through Millbrook the way it always did, quiet and unhurried, and by the following week, 2 other shopkeepers had heard enough of it to view Derek's version of events with a little less certainty than before, not enough to matter to the Whitmores whose money insulated them from most consequences, but enough that Nate walked through town afterward without quite so many eyes sliding past him as though he were invisible, or worse, as though he were exactly what Derek had called him. It was not vindication. Nate understood that even then, young as he was, but it was something a woman standing beside him in a doorway refusing to let a lie stand unchallenged, simply because challenging it was inconvenient. He had never had that before. He did not know that evening how many years it would take before he learned to give that same gift to someone else. By the time the last frost broke and the trees along Elm Street began pushing out their first stubborn buds, Nate had found steadier work at the rail yard, enough to rent a narrow room above the laundromat 2 blocks from the diner. His first real roof, his first real door with a lock he alone controlled. He still came to Bennett's diner most evenings, though now he came to pay rather than to be fed, sliding coins across the counter for pie and coffee, watching with a strange, aching pride as Ruth counted out his change without a flicker of surprise, as though she had always known this was where things were headed. He was 17 the night he told her he meant to leave Millbrook. He said it carefully, watching her face for some sign of hurt, some accusation of ingratitude, because he had begun in the months of her kindness to fear disappointing her more than he feared almost anything else. But Ruth only nodded, slowly wiping down no cried way. No cried na said. No cried, no cried. No cried, no cried agried. No caven, no cried. No criven. The Ruth only nodded, slowly wiping down the counter in that same unhurried way she did everything, and said, "Good. Go somewhere they don't already have their minds made up about who you are." "I don't know how to thank you," Nate said, and his voice cracked on the words in a way that embarrassed him even as he spoke them. "For any of it. The food, the job, standing up for me that night. I didn't have anybody, and then I had you, and I don't know how a person pays that back." Ruth set down her rag and looked at him for a long moment, and something passed over her face that Nate would not fully understand, until many years later, a kind of quiet, private sorrow, as though his gratitude had touched some older wound of her own that she chose that evening not to name. "You don't pay it back to me," she said finally. "That's not how it works. Someday, somewhere down the road, you're going to see somebody standing outside in the cold the way you were standing outside my window that first night, and you're going to remember what it felt like. That's the payment. Not to me, to whoever comes after you." Nate carried those words with him the way another boy might have carried a photograph folded small and kept close, turned over so many times in the years that followed, that their edges wore smooth in his memory, even as the specific circumstances of that evening, the smell of coffee, the steam on the window, the particular slant of lamplight across Ruth's tired, kind face began slowly and against his will to blur. The morning he left Millbrook for good, he stood outside the diner before it opened, before the sky had fully lightened, and pressed his forehead briefly against the cool glass of the door, unable to bring himself to knock and wake her. Unwilling to make the goodbye any harder than it already was, he left instead a folded note tucked into the door handle, 3 sentences, all he could manage without his hand shaking too badly to write, and walked to the edge of town where the highway began. His duffel bag lighter now of debts, and heavier of purpose, and did not look back until Millbrook had shrunk to nothing behind him. He did not know, walking away that morning with everything he owned slung over one shoulder, that it would be nearly 30 years before he understood the full weight of what Ruth Bennett had given him. Not simply food, not simply a job, but the entire architecture of the man he would eventually become. A man who built an empire on the quiet, unglamorous conviction that no one ever again should have to stand alone outside a window in the cold, hoping someone inside might notice them and choose for no reason at all to be kind. Many years later, though, the road between that morning in Millbrook and this one had been longer and harder than any 19-year-old boy with a duffel bag could have imagined. Nathan Hargrove stood in the loading dock of his first real warehouse, a converted grain silo on the outskirts of Columbus, its walls still smelling of rust and diesel, and allowed himself, for perhaps the first time in a decade, to believe that his life might finally be turning toward something solid. He was 31 years old. He owned 4 trucks, a leased garage, and a business plan so precarious that a single bad month could still unravel everything he had built since walking away from Ohio's steel country, with nothing but calloused hands and a memory of a diner he could not bring himself to think about too often, because thinking about it still opened something in his chest he had learned over the years to keep carefully sealed. He had built Hargrove Freight from almost nothing, a single delivery route hauling produce between small-town grocers who couldn't afford the larger distributors. A business born not from ambition but from necessity, the same stubborn instinct for survival that had once kept him alive behind an old cannery in the cold. He worked 18-hour days. He slept more nights than not in the cab of his own truck rather than pay for a motel room he couldn't afford. And slowly, methodically, the way a man builds something when he has never once been allowed the luxury of believing it might simply be given to him, he grew the business into something real. It was at a regional trade conference in a hotel ballroom that still felt to Nate uncomfortably grand for someone who could remember exactly what it felt like to eat out of a garbage bag that he first met Vivian Cross. She was the daughter of a real estate family whose name appeared on half the shopping centers in 3 counties, and she moved through the ballroom that evening, with an ease that Nate found himself watching from across the room the way a man watches something he has never before believed himself entitled to want. She was clever in a way that startled him, quick, unimpressed by flattery, the kind of woman who asked pointed questions about his logistics margins rather than making polite small talk about the weather. When she approached him directly, introduced herself, and asked without preamble how a man with 4 trucks intended to compete against distributors with 400. Nate found himself for the first time in longer than he could remember, laughing. A real laugh, unguarded, startled out of him before. He'd had time to build his usual careful wall around it. Over the months that followed, something between them deepened in a way Nate had never allowed himself before. He had kept people at a careful, calculated distance for years, an instinct born, though he rarely examined it closely in a boy who had learned too early that the people who were supposed to protect you could disappear, could turn cruel, vanish into whiskey and silence without warning. But Vivian was different, or seemed to be. She listened to him talk about Millbrook, the parts he could bear to tell her, at least with an attentiveness that felt to a man starved of exactly that kind of attention his whole life almost unbearably tender. He told her one evening on the porch of the small rented house he'd finally been able to afford, about the cannery, about the cold, about a woman named Ruth Bennett who had once fed him without asking why. He had never told anyone that story in full before. Something about the way Vivian received it quietly, without pity, without the flinching discomfort most people showed, when confronted with real poverty, made him believe foolishly that he had finally found someone safe enough to be fully known by. He proposed on a night in early autumn, the leaves along the Scioto River just beginning to turn, and when she said yes, Nate Hargrove, a man who had once measured success by whether he would eat that day, believed for the first time in his adult life that the world might genuinely owe him something good. 6 weeks before the wedding, Hargrove Freight nearly collapsed. A regional distributor undercut his contracts across 3 counties in the span of a single quarter, and the bank holding his business loan grew nervous, tightening terms demanding collateral Nate did not have readily available. He came home each night during those weeks gray with exhaustion, and it was Vivian sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, who insisted on going through his books line by line, insisted she could help to him find a way through it. Insisted that as his soon-to-be wife she had every right to understand exactly how precarious things had become. He trusted her with all of it. Every account number, every projection, every fragile, desperate contingency plan he had drawn up in the dead of night, terrified of losing everything he had built from nothing a second time in his life. And in a moment of vulnerability, he would spend years regretting, he showed her something else entirely, a folded, yellowed land survey he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, a document he had carried with him since leaving Millbrook. To the last remaining trace of a piece of land his father had once owned along the river before losing it decades earlier to a business partner who had swindled him out of both the land and what little dignity he'd had left before drinking himself into an early grave. Nate had never told anyone about that land. He told Vivian that autumn night, his voice low and unsteady, because for the first time in his life he had believed there was someone he could hand his family's oldest wound to without fear of it being used against him. The night before the wedding, she was gone. Nate did not understand it at first. Arrived at her apartment to find it already stripped, bare, her closet empty. No note, no explanation, only a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence in the room. It took 3 days of frantic, humiliating phone calls before he learned the truth from a mutual acquaintance who delivered it with an almost clinical detachment. Vivian Cross had been quietly seeing another man for months, the heir to a real estate fortune considerably larger than anything Hargrove Freight could ever hope to become, and had simply decided in the final weeks before the wedding that the more secure future lay elsewhere. She married him 3 months later. What Nate did not discover until much further down the road, a discovery that would arrive so many years later that by the time it did, he had almost convinced himself the wound had fully closed, was that his financial records had not simply been left behind in that empty apartment. Nor had the land survey, the last fragile thread connecting him to his father's stolen inheritance, ever turned up again among his things. In the weeks that followed, Nate did not speak of what had happened to anyone, not even to Beau Ferris, the one friend from his earliest days who might have understood without needing an explanation. He simply worked. He renegotiated the loan himself alone through nights so long and grinding that he later remembered almost none of the details. Only the exhaustion. Only the grim, singular focus of a man rebuilding a wall around himself, brick by brick, more carefully this time, more permanently, determined never again to hand anyone the blueprint to his own undoing. He would go on in the years that followed to become extraordinarily successful, wealthy, beyond anything the boy behind the cannery could have imagined, generous in quiet, unpublicized ways that would eventually earn him a reputation as one of the more decent men in an industry not known for decency. But something in him had closed that autumn, closed the way a door closes when the person on the other side of it has finally stopped expecting anyone to walk through. He gave freely to strangers for the rest of his life, He simply never again, not once in the 6 years that followed, allowed himself to fully believe that anyone standing close enough to see the whole of him could be trusted not to leave. 6 years passed the way grief eventually passes for a man who refuses to sit still long enough to feel it not healed, only outrun. Hargrove Freight and Logistics no longer resembled the 4 battered trucks Nate Hargrove had once nursed along back roads between small-town grocers. It had grown quarter by relentless quarter into a distribution network spanning 11 states, its refrigerated trucks a common sight on highways from the Ohio Valley to the Great Lakes, its warehouses employing thousands of people who, for the most part, never once suspected that the soft-spoken man who occasionally walked the loading docks in a plain flannel jacket indistinguishable from any other worker was the billionaire whose name was stenciled on every truck door. Nate had built his reputation carefully, deliberately, on a foundation entirely different from the one Vivian Cross had once tried to convince him he needed. He did not attend galas if he could help it. He did not give interviews about his success. What he did, quietly and without publicity, was extend credit to struggling grocers and diners across his delivery routes, when other distributors would have cut them off without a second thought. A policy his board of directors questioned every fiscal year, and which Nate every fiscal year refused to change. He never explained the reason to anyone. He did not need to. Every time he approved another extension, another grace period for some small-town owner, 3 payments behind, some quiet part of him returned briefly and involuntarily to a boy standing outside a fogged window on a cold night in Millbrook, hoping someone inside might notice him and choose for no reason at all to be kind. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday during a routine review of accounts flagged for repeated late payment that a name on the list caught his attention in a way he could not immediately explain. Bennett's Diner. Small operation, family-owned 3 generations deep, according to the file, currently 4 months behind on its supply invoices, though every payment that did arrive came with a handwritten note apologizing for the delay and promise the balance would be settled in full. Nate sat with the file open on his desk for a long moment, an old and unfamiliar ache stirring somewhere beneath his ribs before telling himself it was only the name, a common enough name, surely nothing more than coincidence. He drove out to see the account himself the following week, an unusual enough occurrence that his operations team assumed some larger problem had prompted it. He told no one the truth, that some part of him needed to see the place with his own eyes before he could set the coincidence aside entirely. The diner sat on a quiet corner 2 counties over from Millbrook, its neon sign reading Bennett's Diner in full. This time no missing letters, though the paint along its edges had faded with age. Nate parked across the street and sat in his truck for several minutes before going in, watching through the window as a woman moved between the counter and the kitchen with a rhythm so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of a memory he had spent 30 years trying not to disturb too often, that his chest tightened before he had even opened the door. Her name, he would learn, was Grace Bennett. She was not the woman from his memory. Could not have been. He understood immediately the age was wrong. The face was different, though. Something in the set of her shoulders, in the unhurried, unbothered way she refilled a stranger's coffee, without being asked, struck him with a force he had not braced himself for. He sat at the counter, ordered a slice of pie he did not particularly want, and watched her work, and told himself, with the same stubborn discipline he had used to convince himself of a great many inconvenient truths over the years, that it meant nothing at all. It was near closing, the dinner crowd thinned to only a handful of regulars, when he finally introduced himself not as the owner of Hargrove Freight, but simply as Nate, a supplier checking in on an account. Grace apologized immediately for the outstanding balance, her explanation arriving quickly and without excuse, making the words of someone accustomed to shouldering blame rather than deflecting it. Her mother had passed the diner down to her 3 years earlier. The building needed repairs faster than the business could generate the cash to cover them, and she had fallen behind, and she understood if the account needed to be reassigned to a different vendor, and she would make it right regardless, however long it took. Nate listened to all of it without interrupting, and something in her honesty landed on him with unexpected weight. She was not asking for pity. She was not offering excuses dressed up as circumstance the way so many of the accounts he reviewed did. She was simply telling him the truth plainly, the way a person tells the truth when they have decided somewhere along the way that dishonesty costs more than it is ever worth. It reminded him more than he was prepared to admit even to himself of someone he had not allowed himself to think about too closely in a very long time. There's no need to reassign anything, he told her, and something in his own voice surprised him, a gentleness he had not offered a stranger in years, not since he had learned exactly how expensive gentleness could become when handed to the wrong person. Take the time you need. Just keep sending the notes. Grace looked at him with a mixture of confusion and cautious gratitude, clearly unaccustomed to a supplier extending grace rather than threatening to cut her off. And Nate found himself in that brief exchange, feeling something he had not felt in longer than he cared to calculate, not romantic interest. Not yet nothing so simple or so soon, but something quieter, and in its own way more unsettling. The sensation of a door he had spent 6 years keeping carefully bolted shifting ever so slightly on its hinges. He drove back to Columbus that night without telling anyone where he had been, and for reasons he could not entirely articulate, he found himself over the following weeks quietly instructing his accounts team to extend Bennett's Diner's payment terms indefinitely, without flagging the account for review, without explaining why. It was, he told himself, simply good business, a small operation worth protecting, nothing more. He did not examine too closely why he found himself, more evenings than he cared to admit, thinking of a woman he had met exactly once, moving between a counter and a kitchen with a rhythm that echoed something in him he had believed until quite recently was permanently sealed away. That same autumn, several counties over, Derek Whitmore graduated from law school with honors, a fact that made the local paper in the small machine shop town where he'd grown up, his photograph printed above a headline celebrating a hometown boy's rise. His mother Margaret kept three copies of the clipping, framing one for the mantel above the fireplace, mailing another to relatives she had not spoken to in years, tucking the third into her purse to show anyone who happened to ask what her son had accomplished. Derek did not think that autumn of a hardware store or a hinge or a boy he had pointed a finger at more than a decade earlier. He had built in the years since a version of himself that required no memory of Millbrook at all, polished, ambitious, entirely convinced that the world had simply recognized in him what had always obviously been there. He accepted an offer from a respected firm in the city, packed the modest belongings of his modest upbringing into the back of a second-hand car, and drove toward a future he was already certain he had earned entirely on his own. Neither man that autumn, the billionaire quietly extending grace to a diner he could not fully explain his interest in, and the young lawyer driving toward a career built partly, though he did not know it, on a lie he'd told without second thought at 17, had any notion that their two paths, laid down years apart across the same battered landscape of eastern Ohio, had already begun slowly and inevitably to bend back toward one another. Several years earlier, before Hargrove Freight had grown large enough to need an accounts department at all, and long before Nate Hargrove had any reason to think of Bennett's Diner as anything more than a name on an invoice, Derek Whitmore had been a fixture at the counter 3 nights a week. Hunched over a second-hand law textbook with a cup of coffee, he stretched across 2 hours because he could not afford to order a second. Grace Bennett had been 24, then newly responsible for the diner after her mother's health began to fail, still learning the particular exhaustion of running a business that never quite generated enough to cover both the mortgage and the wages she owed her one part-time cook. She noticed Derek the way she noticed most of her regulars, by his order, by his habits, by the small, unremarkable details that added up over months into something like familiarity. He was polite in a careful, deliberate way, the manner of someone who had learned early that politeness cost nothing and occasionally bought forgiveness. He was ambitious in a way he did not bother to hide, speaking often and at length about the firm he intended to join someday, the life he intended to build, the town he intended to leave behind the moment he had the means to do it. Grace found herself, without entirely deciding, to refilling his coffee, without charging him for the second cup. Then, covering his tab outright on the nights, she noticed his hands counting change too carefully. Then eventually, without either of them naming the moment it happened, quietly paying the difference on his tuition when the community college's night program raised its fees, and Derek sat at her counter with his head in his hands, certain he would have to withdraw. "You don't have to do this," he told her that night, and there had been something in his voice, raw, unguarded, entirely unlike the polished ambition he usually wore, that made Grace believe with the particular conviction of a young woman who has never yet been given a reason not to trust someone, that she was witnessing the real Derek Whitmore beneath the performance, and that the real one was worth investing in. She sold over the 2 years that followed nearly everything of value she owned that wasn't nailed to the diner's walls. She took a second loan against the building her mother had left her, using the diner itself as collateral, telling herself each time that it was an investment in their shared future, rather than a debt Derek alone was accumulating. She sat with him some nights until closing, quizzing him from his textbooks, watching him absorb case law with a hunger that reminded her, in its way, of her own mother's stubborn, unglamorous determination to keep the diner alive through years that should by any reasonable measure have closed it. They married the spring. Derek finished his coursework in a small ceremony behind the diner, with folding chairs borrowed from the church 2 blocks over. Derek's mother, Margaret, cried through the entire service, gripping Grace's hands afterward, with a warmth that felt in that moment entirely genuine. "You have given my son a future," Margaret told her, "and I will never forget it." Grace believed her. Nearly a year later, Derek accepted a position at a respected firm in the city. The culmination, he told everyone who would listen, of years of sacrifice and discipline, though he rarely specified in these retellings exactly whose sacrifice had carried the weight of it. He and Grace kept the diner, kept the small house behind it, and for a while the arrangement held together well enough that Grace allowed herself to believe the hardest years were finally behind them. The firm hosted a reception that autumn to welcome its newest associates, a polished affair in a downtown hotel ballroom, and Derek had insisted with more enthusiasm than Grace had heard from him in months that she come. She wore the one dress in her closet nice enough for such an occasion, borrowed a strand of pearls from a neighbor, and spent the drive into the city rehearsing with a nervousness that embarrassed her a little. The names of the partners Derek had mentioned she should be sure to greet properly. The ballroom was full of a kind of ease. Grace had never quite learned people who discussed vacation homes and vintage wine, the way she discussed flower prices and supplier invoices, their laughter light and unhurried in a way that made her acutely aware of the flour still faintly ground into the written creases of her own hands, no amount of scrubbing ever quite lifting it out entirely. She found Derek near the bar, deep in conversation with a senior partner and his wife, and approached with a smile, already forming her hand, already reaching to rest briefly at the small of his back, the way she always had. And this as the partner began turning toward her with the polite, expectant look of a man waiting to be introduced properly. Derek's eyes flicked to Grace for the briefest instant, a fraction of a second so quick that afterward Grace would spend hours wondering whether she had imagined the hesitation entirely, before he said in a voice smooth and unbothered, as though the words cost him nothing at all, "An old friend of the family. From back home." The sentence landed in Grace's chest like something physical, a door closing somewhere deep inside her with a quiet final click. She stood there a moment longer than the exchange required, waiting for a correction, a laugh, some acknowledgement that Derek had simply misspoken, that he would turn back to the partner and say, "No, I'm sorry, this is my wife," but the correction did not come. The partner's wife made polite conversation about the weather for exactly as long as courtesy demanded before the two of them drifted back into the crowd, and Derek beside her simply reached for another glass of wine from a passing tray, entirely unaware, or entirely unwilling to acknowledge what he had just done. Grace did not say anything for the rest of the evening. She smiled where smiling was expected. She nodded politely through conversations she could not afterward remember a single word of. And on the drive home, staring out at the dark ribbon of highway unspooling ahead of them, she finally asked in a voice she worked hard to keep steady why he had introduced her the way he had. Derek's answer came too quickly, too smoothly, the answer of a man who had already rehearsed it somewhere in the back of his mind before he'd ever needed it. "You're overthinking it, Grace. These people don't need our whole history laid out for them at a cocktail party. It's not a big deal." "It felt like a big deal to me," Grace said quietly, and something in her own voice surprised her. A thinness, a fragility she had not expected to hear there, as though the sentence had cost her something to say aloud. Derek did not answer. He turned the radio on instead, filling the car with a low, indifferent hum of talk radio, and Grace sat beside him in the dark, watching the mile markers slide past the window, and understood with a clarity that frightened her more than she was ready to admit that something between them had shifted that evening in a way she did not yet have the language to name a first. Hairline crack running quietly beneath the surface of a marriage she had spent 2 years of her life, and every dollar she had ever managed to save building. She did not know driving home in that silence that it was only the first of many such evenings still waiting for her. She knew only that somewhere in that ballroom, in the space of a single careless sentence, her husband had made a choice about which parts of himself he was willing to claim in front of people he wanted to impress, and that she had not that choice been counted among them. Weeks passed, and the crack from that autumn evening did not close so much as widen quietly in the spaces between ordinary days. Margaret Whitmore began visiting more often that season, always with some pretext, a casserole dish to return a recipe she'd meant to pass along, a reason to be in the neighborhood that never quite held up to scrutiny. Grace welcomed her each time with the same instinctive hospitality she extended to every customer who walked through the diner's doors, setting out coffee, offering pie, asking after Margaret's garden and her bridge club with a warmth she genuinely felt, even as some smaller, Wearier part of her had already begun to brace itself before each visit the way a person braces against a wind they know is coming. "You're still wearing that apron at all hours, I see," Margaret said one afternoon, settling herself at the counter with the particular unhurried comfort of someone who considered the space more rightfully hers than Grace's. She said it lightly, almost as an aside, the way she said most of the things that left a mark. A man in Derek's position, people notice these things, you understand. It isn't a criticism. It's simply how the world works. Grace kept her hands moving, wiping down a section of counter that did not need wiping, because it gave her somewhere to look that wasn't Margaret's face. "The diner's my mother's, Margaret. It's who I am." "Of course it is," Margaret said in the tone of someone conceding a point she did not actually believe. "But who you are and who Derek needs standing beside him now, those aren't always the same thing, dear. A man doesn't climb as far as my son is climbing by carrying the ladder himself the whole way up." Grace said nothing to that. She had learned over the months of these visits that arguing only extended them, that the quickest path back to peace was simply to let Margaret's words pass through the room and settle somewhere. Grace could not quite locate afterward, though she noticed increasingly that they never fully dissolved. They gathered instead quietly in some private reservoir behind her ribs, and some nights, lying awake beside a husband who had begun coming home later and later from the firm, she felt the weight of all those accumulated words pressing down on her chest, until she found it strangely difficult to draw a full breath. It was Derek's mother's church group of all things that finally forced the low, simmering tension between them into the open. Margaret had organized a fundraising luncheon for the parish building fund, the sort of event Grace had attended dutifully for years without complaint, comfortable enough among the women there, despite the gulf that sometimes opened between her calloused hands and their manicured ones. But that spring Margaret pulled her aside before the guests arrived, her voice pitched low and confidential in a way that made Grace's stomach tighten before a single word had been said. "I only mention this because I care for you, Grace, truly," Margaret began, which was, Grace had come to understand, always the preface to something that would leave a bruise. "But some of the other wives have been asking after you, asking specifically whether you still work the counter yourself. I told them of course not, that you manage the business now that you have people for that sort of thing." She paused, straightening a fold in the tablecloth that did not need straightening. "It would ease things considerably, if that were actually true." "I don't have money to hire someone," Margaret Grace said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show. "I'm the person for that sort of thing." "Then perhaps it's time to think about whether the diner is worth the cost it's extracting from my son's future," Margaret said. And there it was, the sentence Grace had felt building beneath every visit for months, finally. Spoken plainly enough that it could no longer be mistaken for anything other than what it was. "I'm not asking you to abandon it entirely, only to consider whether there might be a version of your life that fits more comfortably alongside his." Grace stood very still for a long moment, the noise of the luncheon crowd gathering in the next room, feeling suddenly distant, muffled, as though she were hearing it from underwater. She thought of her mother, who had run that diner for 30 years with hands that never once stopped moving, who had fed a hungry stranger on a cold night without asking his name, who had told Grace once, not long before she passed, that a person's worth was never measured by the size of the room they were allowed to stand in. "My mother built that diner from nothing," Grace said finally, quietly, though something steadier had entered her voice than had been there a moment before. "I'm not ashamed of it. I don't think I ever will be, no matter what room I'm standing in." Margaret's expression did not soften, but something flickered briefly across it, something almost like recognition, though Grace would not understand its meaning until much later. "Pride is a fine thing to have when you can afford it," Margaret said, and then excused herself to greet the arriving guests, leaving Grace standing alone by the tablecloth, her hands trembling slightly at her sides in a way she hoped no one would notice. That evening, driving home, Grace finally told Derek what his mother had said, watching his profile for some reaction as the streetlight slid rhythmically across the windshield. Derek was quiet for a long stretch of road before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried an exhaustion that had become, Grace realized with a small sinking feeling, its own kind of habit between them. "She means well, Grace. She's only trying to help us. She told me to consider giving up the diner. She didn't say give it up. She said consider Derek." Grace's voice cracked on his name in a way that startled them both. "Do you agree with her?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched in Grace's memory afterward into something far longer, long enough for her to notice with a clarity that frightened her that her husband had not answered immediately, had not reached for her hand the way he once would have had, not said without hesitation, "Of course not, don't be ridiculous." He simply kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, and said finally in a voice too careful to be reassuring, "I think it's a conversation worth having eventually. That's all." Grace turned to look out her own window at the dark fields sliding past and said nothing more for the rest of the drive. She understood in the silence that filled the car, something she had not fully allowed herself to understand before that evening, that the crack from the reception hall months earlier had not healed in the time since. It had simply gone quiet, burrowing deeper, waiting. She did not cry that night. She had learned somewhere in the 2 years since her wedding the same lesson Nate Hargrove had learned as a boy behind a Millbrook cannery, that tears rarely changed anything, that the wiser course was often simply to keep moving, to keep the diner open, to keep believing against a mounting and quietly devastating weight of evidence that the man she had given everything to build a future for still recognized somewhere beneath the polish the city had given him, the woman who had once counted out her savings on a diner counter and decided he was worth every dollar of it. But that night, lying awake long after Derek's breathing had evened into sleep beside her, Grace found herself thinking for the first time of a question she had never once let herself ask before: what would happen to her, to the diner, to the life her mother had built, if the answer to that belief turned out eventually to be no. 2 winters after Grace's conversation with Margaret in the church hall, and roughly 6 months into the quiet, unexamined habit Nate Hargrove had developed of driving out to check on the Bennett's diner account more often than in reasonable business justification required, the diner's ancient walk-in freezer finally gave out. It happened on a Thursday night, the temperature outside already dropping hard toward freezing, the compressor letting out one long final groan before falling silent sometime after midnight. Grace discovered it the following morning when she arrived to open, the smell hitting her before she'd even flipped on the lights. The unmistakable sickening sweetness of spoiling meat, a week's worth of inventory already beginning to turn in the warming air. She stood in the doorway of the walk-in for a long moment, one hand pressed flat against the frame, to steady herself, doing the arithmetic in her head with a kind of dull, disbelieving horror. A health inspection was scheduled for the following week. She did not have the cash reserves to replace a commercial freezer on short notice, and every hour the spoiled inventory sat unaddressed only widened the loss. She thought briefly, and with a bitterness that surprised her, of Margaret's voice suggesting she consider whether the diner was worth the cost it was extracting from her life, and then pushed the thought away because there was no time that morning for anything but action. She called her supplier's emergency line out of habit, more than expectation, fully prepared to be told, as she usually was, that service calls took 2 to 3 business days. Nate Hargrove picked up the call himself. "I'll have someone there within the hour," he told her, his voice carrying an urgency that startled Grace slightly, an urgency that seemed disproportionate, though she was too relieved and too exhausted to examine it closely in the moment. What she did not know, what she would not learn for a long while yet, was that Nate had been sitting in his office reviewing that week's account summaries when her call came through, and that something in the operator's voice reading off the address had sent him reaching for his own keys before he'd fully decided to go himself, rather than simply dispatching a technician. He arrived within the hour as promised, though not alone. He had called his oldest friend along the way, Beau Ferris, who had driven a truck for Nate back when Hargrove Freight was still only 4 vehicles and a prayer, and who now ran operations for the entire company, though he still preferred most days to be found in a garage with grease on his hands rather than behind a desk. Beau took one look at the compressor, muttered something about the unit being older than either of them, and set to work with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent his whole life fixing things other people had given up on. Nate, meanwhile, stayed close to Grace, helping her haul the ruined inventory out to the dumpster behind the building, working alongside her in a silence that felt to Grace's surprise less awkward than companionable, the shared, unglamorous labor of 2 people simply trying to keep something from falling apart. "You didn't have to come yourself," Grace said at one point, wiping her forearm across her face, leaving a faint streak of grime along her cheekbone she wasn't aware of. "I called about a compressor, not a house call from the company owner." Nate paused, a crate balanced against his hip, and for a moment, something passed behind his eyes that Grace could not quite read. Some flicker of memory quickly suppressed, quickly folded back beneath the composed, unhurried manner. He wore the way other men wore a suit. "Where I come from," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, "a freezer full of spoiled food isn't a minor inconvenience. I know what that kind of loss costs a place like this. I'd rather be here than let it become a bigger problem than it needs to be." Grace did not press further, though something in the careful, deliberate way he'd said it lodged itself in her memory, regardless, a sentence that seemed to be carrying more weight than its plain words suggested, spoken by a man who clearly understood hunger and loss in a way that had nothing to do with balance sheets. It was well past dark by the time the new compressor unit had been installed and tested, the freezer humming steadily back to life, and Beau Ferris finally straightened up from beneath the machinery, wiping his hands on a rag and studying his friend across the length of the kitchen with an expression Nate recognized immediately and had hoped that evening to avoid. They spoke in the parking lot afterward, Grace still inside settling accounts for the emergency repair, the two men leaning against the tailgate of Nate's truck in the cold, their breath fogging faintly under the security light. "You want to tell me why the owner of an 11-state logistics company is personally hand-carrying spoiled hamburger meat to a dumpster on a Thursday night?" Beau asked not unkindly, though there was an edge beneath the question that had not been there in years, not since the last time Nate realized with a small uncomfortable jolt that Beau had watched him come apart quietly over a woman he had trusted with too much, too fast. "It's a good account. I like to check in on the ones that need it," Nate said, and even as he said it, he heard how thin the explanation sounded stretched across a Thursday night house call. Beau didn't answer right away. He looked past Nate toward the lit window of the diner where Grace's silhouette moved behind the counter, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its edge, replaced by something closer to worry, the particular familiar worry of a man who had once helped his best friend rebuild an Artemis entire life out of the wreckage a woman had left behind, and had promised himself silently that he would never watch it happen a second time. "Nate," he said, "I was there. I remember what it did to you when Vivian walked out. I remember 3 years of you working 18-hour days, so you wouldn't have to sit still long enough to feel it. I'm not saying this woman's anything like her. I don't know her at all. But you've got a habit of handing yourself over to people before you've had time to find out whether they deserve it, and I've watched what it costs you when you're wrong." Nate was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the same lit window. Beau had been watching on Grace's silhouette, moving with the same unhurried, unbothered rhythm he had first noticed the evening he'd walked into her diner as a stranger checking on a late account. Something in him wanted badly to explain to tell Beau about the note in the accounts file, about a memory of a woman behind a different diner counter 30 years earlier, about a debt he had carried unnamed and unexamined for most of his adult life. But the words felt too large, too fragile, too easily misunderstood, if spoken aloud in a cold parking lot before he had even fully untangled them himself. "It's not what you think it is," he said instead, which was in its own careful way entirely true, though it did nothing to ease the concern still etched across his oldest friend's face. "Maybe not," Beau said, pushing off the tailgate, his tone gentling into something more like the easy familiarity of 30 years of friendship. "But do me a favor and be careful anyway. I'd rather warn you and be wrong than watch you walk into that same fire twice and say nothing." Nate did not answer, only nodded, watching Beau climb into the passenger seat and settle in for the drive back to Columbus. He lingered a moment longer in the cold, looking once more toward the diner's window, toward the woman inside who had no idea what her presence had quietly begun to loosen in a man who had spent 6 careful years making certain nothing ever could. He did not yet have a name for what he was feeling. He knew only that some part of him, long dormant, had shifted that evening, in a way he was no longer entirely sure he had the power to reverse, and that his oldest friend, watching from the passenger seat with a worry he had not bothered to fully hide, might already understand that better than Nate himself was ready to admit. A few weeks after the freezer was repaired, on a quiet Sunday morning when the diner was closed and the streets outside sat hushed under a thin early frost, Grace asked Nate if he wouldn't mind helping her clear out the old storeroom behind the kitchen. The building's insurance company had finally agreed to inspect the space for structural repairs, and 3 generations of accumulated clutter needed to be sorted through before the adjuster arrived. Crates of mismatched dishware, a broken jukebox, no one had gotten around to hauling away boxes of receipts going back further than either of them could easily account for. It was meant to be a simple favor, an hour or two of lifting and stacking, nothing more. Nate had told himself the same thing on the drive over that he had told himself on every visit since the night of the freezer, that this was simply good stewardship of a valued account, that there was nothing more complicated at work than a supplier looking after a business worth protecting. He was aware in some quiet corner of himself he did not examine too closely, that the explanation had grown thinner with each repetition. They worked mostly in comfortable silence, Grace directing him toward boxes destined for the dumpster, and boxes worth keeping her hands moving with the same brisk efficiency he had come to associate with her, whether she was flipping eggs on the griddle or hauling a crate of chipped coffee mugs. It was well into the second hour, the two of them dust-streaked and easy with each other in a way that had crept up on them both without either quite noticing when it had started, that Nate's hand closed around a small cloth-bound ledger, tucked into the bottom of a box marked in faded pencil Mama's Things. "You can toss that one if it's just old receipts," Grace said, glancing over from across the room, not paying it much attention. Nate opened it anyway, some instinct he could not name, pulling his thumb beneath the cover before he had consciously decided to look. The pages inside were filled with a careful looping handwriting, a running record he realized after a moment of meals given away over the years, without charge names and dates and small notations beside each entry. The private ledger of a woman keeping track in her own quiet way of every kindness Diner's books would never officially record. His eyes moved down the page without urgency at first, and then somewhere near the middle of a column dated deep in autumn they stopped entirely. Boy torn coat, no name given. Fed him supper, told him come back tomorrow. And beneath it a week later, in the same careful hand. Same boy, still no name, doesn't ask for anything. Going to find him work at Kessler's if I can manage it. Nate did not move. The storeroom around him seemed for a long moment to recede entirely, the boxes, the dust motes hanging in the thin morning light. Grace's voice somewhere behind him asking whether he'd found something worth keeping, all of it fading, beneath the sudden, overwhelming rush of a memory he had spent 30 years keeping carefully, deliberately unexamined. A diner window fogged with steam. A woman wiping her hands on her apron before crossing to hold the door open unbothered, as though there was nothing at all remarkable about feeding a stranger who could not pay. Well, don't just stand there letting the heat out. Nate Grace had crossed the room without his noticing, her hand light on his shoulder, her brow creased with concern at whatever expression had settled over his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He could not for several long seconds find any words at all. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out rougher than he intended, unsteady, in a way he had not allowed himself to sound in front of another person in longer than he could remember. "Your mother's name," he said. "It was Ruth, wasn't it? Ruth Bennett." Something shifted in Grace's expression. Surprise first, then a slower, more careful curiosity. "How do you know that I never told you her name?" Nate closed the ledger gently as though it were something that might break and sat back against the edge of a stacked crate, his legs suddenly unwilling to hold him steady. He told her then, haltingly at first, the words coming in fragments. He had to force past a throat that had gone tight and unfamiliar, and then once the first sentences were out in a rush, he could not have stopped, even if he'd wanted to. He told her about a boy of 16 behind an eastern Ohio cannery, about a coat too thin for the winter it was asked to survive, about a diner window and a woman who had asked no questions before setting down a plate. He told her about the job at the hardware store arranged through a favor Ruth Bennett had called in on his behalf, staking her own name on his reliability, without hesitation. He told her, his voice catching hard on this part, about the words her mother had said to him the night he left town for good. "Someday you're going to see somebody standing outside in the cold, and you're going to remember what it felt like, and how he had carried that instruction, with him unspoken and unexamined through every quiet act of kindness he had extended in the 30 years, since never once understanding until this exact moment that he had spent his entire adult life trying to repay a debt to a woman whose daughter he had, by some improbable turn of fate, been extending grace to, without knowing why." Grace sat very still through all of it, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears gathering and finally spilling before she seemed to notice they had started. "She never told me," she said finally, her voice thick. "She helped so many people over the years. I never knew which ones. She never wanted credit for any of it. She wouldn't have wanted it," Nate said quietly. "She told me that herself. Said the payment wasn't owed to her, it was owed to whoever came after." They sat together in the dusty quiet of the storeroom for a long while after that, neither of them in any hurry to break the fragile, weighted silence that had settled over the room, and Grace found herself, without entirely deciding to, reaching for his hand. Not out of romance, not yet, but out of the simple human need to hold on to something solid, in the wake of a discovery too large to absorb alone. It was only later that evening, driving the dark highway back toward Columbus, with the ledger's contents still turning over and over in his mind, that a second memory surfaced, one Nate had spent years keeping buried far deeper than the first, precisely because it carried none of the warmth. He thought of Warren Kessler's hardware store, of a boy his own age, with an easy smile and expensive shoes, pointing a finger without a flicker of hesitation. "He doesn't even have a real home." He had never learned in all the years since what had become of that boy, had never allowed himself to wonder, had built an entire life determined never to look backward at Millbrook longer than necessary. But sitting in his truck on the dark highway, the pieces beginning slowly, and with a sickening clarity, to arrange themselves into a shape he did not want to see, Nate found himself reaching for his phone and typing a name into the search bar He had not spoken aloud in 3 decades. Derek Whitmore, Esquire. The photograph that loaded onto the screen a moment later, older now, more polished, a firm's letterhead framing a confident, practiced smile, struck Nate with a force that nearly made him pull the truck onto the shoulder of the road. It was unmistakably, unforgivingly the same face. Older, prosperous, entirely unrecognizable as anything but successful. And married, the search results told him a moment later, to a woman named Grace. Nate sat in the dark cab of his truck for a long while after that, the engine idling, his hands gripping the wheel, though the truck had not moved, turning over a coincidence too vast and too cruel to be entirely accidental, a debt owed to a mother, a wound carried since boyhood, and a woman standing, unknowingly, at the exact intersection of both. Somewhere beneath the shock, quiet and unbidden, another feeling was already beginning to take root, something he did not yet have a name for. Something that felt in that moment less like the discovery of a coincidence, and more like the slow, inevitable turning of a debt finally coming due. For several days after the discovery in the storeroom, Nate said nothing further to Grace about Derek Whitmore. He drove back to Columbus each evening, carrying the weight of what he now knew, turning it over in the quiet of his empty house, the way a man turns over a stone he suspects is hiding something dangerous beneath it. He told himself at first that the timing simply wasn't right, that Grace had enough to manage without the added burden of learning her husband had once, as a careless teenager, cost a hungry stranger his job and his last shred of dignity in a hardware store neither of them had thought about in 30 years. He told himself later something closer to the truth, that he did not yet trust himself to raise the subject without revealing more of what he felt for her than either of them was prepared to name. He did not want Grace to think he had come to her out of some abstract, decades-old grievance against her husband. He did not want the 2 debts, the one he owed her mother and the one entirely separate and far more complicated that he was beginning to feel toward Grace herself, tangled together in a way that made either of them impossible to trust as sincere. So he kept the second discovery folded away, the way he had once folded away a torn photograph in the bottom of a duffel bag, and told himself it was a kindness rather than a concealment. He continued extending Grace to the diner's account quietly, and without fanfare. The payment terms stretched further than any reasonable business justification allowed. He drove out on weekends under the thin cover of checking on supply logistics, and stayed longer than logistics ever required, and told Beau Ferris when asked directly only that the account remained a priority worth his personal attention. Beau did not push further, though. The concern in his eyes each time the subject came up had not fully faded. Derek Whitmore, in the weeks that followed, remained entirely unaware that a debt from his own adolescence had quietly resurfaced 2 counties away. His attention that season had turned towards something else entirely, a conversation casual at first, with a colleague at the firm who specialized in commercial real estate, mentioned almost in passing over lunch. The colleague had been reviewing zoning proposals for a stretch of riverside property slated for redevelopment, and Derek, listening with only half his attention, had felt something sharpen abruptly when the colleague mentioned the parcel numbers under discussion, a stretch that included, among several smaller properties, the corner lot where Bennett's Diner had stood for 3 generations. That whole strip's about to be worth 4 or 5 times what it is now, once the development goes through, the colleague said, tapping a folder against the table with the easy confidence of a man discussing an abstraction rather than a family's entire history. Whoever's holding that corner parcel is sitting on more than they realize. Derek said nothing at the time, but the thought lodged itself and did not dislodge easily. He drove home that evening, turning the figures over in his mind, calculating with a cold, methodical precision that unsettled him slightly. Even as he indulged it, the diner's current assessed value against its projected future value, the mortgage Grace still carried against it. The deed itself, which he recalled with a small jolt of clarity, had been refinanced under both their names during the years he'd been in law school, meaning his signature carried equal legal weight to hers over whatever the property eventually became. He did not in that first week allow himself to follow the thought any further than idle calculation, but the seed had been planted, and Derek Whitmore was by then a man well practiced in the particular discipline of allowing convenient thoughts to ripen slowly at their own pace, until they no longer felt like calculation at all, but simply like the natural unfolding of what he had always deserved. Around this same time, Alexandra Pierce, a senior associate at Derek's firm, sharp-eyed and unhurried, the daughter of a family with old money and older expectations, began seeking Derek out with a frequency that had nothing to do with casework. She was in every visible way, everything. The ballroom that had once made Grace feel so acutely out of place had trained Derek to want composed effortlessly at ease among partners and clients capable of discussing case law and wine vintages, with the same unbothered fluency. She complimented Derek's arguments in meetings with a precision that flattered, without seeming to try, and Derek, starved for exactly that kind of recognition after years of feeling as though his ambitions outpaced everyone around him, found himself lingering later at the office on the evenings she happened to be working too. "You could go all the way to partner inside 5 years, you know," Alexandra told him one evening, the two of them alone in a conference room long after the rest of the floor had emptied, the city lights strung out beyond the window like something out of a life Derek had spent his whole adolescence certain would never belong to him, if you had the right positioning, the right image. Derek did not answer immediately, though something in the phrase "the right image" settled into him with the particular weight of a thought he had already quietly begun entertaining on his own. He thought unbidden of Grace's flower-creased hands, of the diner's faded sign, of his mother's careful, persistent commentary about the aprons and the ladders men climbed. He thought too of the parcel numbers his colleague had mentioned at lunch, and felt the two threads, ambition and opportunity, begin almost without his conscious direction to weave themselves together into something he had not yet allowed himself to name outright. "I've been thinking about some changes," he said finally, carefully testing the words the way a man tests ice before committing his full weight to it. "Nothing decided, just thinking." Alexandra did not press him further that evening, though the small, knowing smile she offered as she gathered her things suggested she understood exactly what kind of thinking he meant, and was entirely willing to wait for it to arrive at its own conclusion. Weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, while Grace worked the counter alone, Derek toured a newly built house in a development on the far side of the city. Modern glass fronted, nothing at all like the small house behind the diner where he and Grace had spent the whole of their marriage. He told himself, walking through the empty rooms with the realtor trailing a respectful distance behind, that he was simply gathering information, simply exploring possibilities, the same careful language he had used with himself about the parcel numbers weeks earlier. But standing in the wide, sun-filled kitchen, running his hand along a marble countertop that cost more than Bennett's Diner's entire annual revenue, Derek felt something settle inside him with a finality that surprised even him, a decision arriving all at once, though it had clearly been assembling itself in pieces for weeks, the way a house is built long before anyone notices it standing, complete. He signed the paperwork the following Tuesday, quietly using an account Grace did not know existed, a small reserve he had been setting aside from his salary for the better part of a year without ever telling her why. He told himself, driving home that evening to the small house behind the diner, where Grace was already asleep, exhausted from a full day on her feet, that he had not yet decided anything permanent. He told himself the new house was simply an option, a possibility, nothing more. But some quieter, more honest part of him, the same part that had once pointed a finger at a hungry boy in a hardware store, without a flicker of hesitation, because it had always been easier to protect himself than to tell the truth, understood, even as he lay down beside his sleeping wife that night, that the decision had already been made. What remained now was only the slow, careful work of arranging the world around him so that when the moment finally came to act on it, it would look to anyone watching like something other than what it actually was. The papers arrived on an ordinary Wednesday, delivered by a process server who found Grace behind the counter during the lunch rush, her hands still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. "Are you Grace Whitmore?" the young man asked, and something in the formality of her married name spoken by a stranger holding a manila envelope sent a cold current of dread through her before she had even answered. "That's me," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, aware of the diner's regulars glancing up from their booths, aware of the sudden hush settling over the room the way a hush settles before a storm breaks. "You've been served," the man said, and held the envelope out to her with the flat, practiced indifference of someone who delivered such news several times a day and had long ago stopped feeling the weight of it. "Petition for divorce. You'll want to have that looked over by an attorney." Grace stood frozen behind the counter for a long moment. After he'd gone, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands, the diner around her seeming to recede into a distant, muffled hum. She did not open it there in front of the lunch crowd in front of Dottie from the general store 2 doors down, who had already half risen from her booth with concern etched across her face. She simply folded it without a word and carried it into the small office behind the kitchen and closed the door, and sat down at her mother's old desk, and finally, with hands that would not quite steady themselves, tore it open. The words on the page did not at first fully register as real, irreconcilable differences. A phrase so clinical, so bloodless that it seemed impossible it could describe 2 years of counting out savings on a diner counter, of quizzing a nervous young man from case law textbooks, until closing of a wedding behind the diner with folding chairs borrowed from the church. But it was the second page that stopped her breath entirely. A request laid out in careful legal language for the court to award Derek full possession of the marital home and the diner property on the grounds. The petition stated of the respondent's improper closeness with a business associate, one Nathan Hargrove, which has caused the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. Grace read the sentence 3 times before the words fully assembled themselves into something she could believe her husband had actually written, or more precisely had actually allowed his attorney to write on his behalf. She thought of Nate hauling spoiled inventory to the dumpster on a cold night, of the two of them sorting through her mother's storeroom in dusty, companionable silence, of a hand resting briefly wordlessly over hers after he'd told of her about the boy in the torn coat. There had been nothing in any of it that deserved the word improper, and yet there it was, printed in stark black type, ready to be read by a judge, by a courtroom, by anyone in town who happened to hear. She did not cry immediately. The shock sat too heavy and too strange for tears at first, a numbness spreading through her chest that felt almost like relief compared to what she suspected was coming once the numbness finally wore off. She sat at her mother's desk for a long while, the diner's ordinary noise continuing faintly beyond the closed door, the clatter of plates, Dottie's worried voice asking someone whether Grace was all right, and stared at her husband's signature at the bottom of the page, small and precise, the same careful cursive he had once used to fill out scholarship applications. She had helped him complete at that very counter. She called Derek that evening, her voice steadier than she expected, though something in it must have carried more than she intended, because he did not pick up until the 4th ring. "I got the papers," she said, no preamble, no accusation, yet simply a statement laid flat between them. "I figured you would," Derek said, and there was something in his voice Grace had never heard directed at her before. A careful, rehearsed distance, the voice of a man reciting a position rather than speaking to a wife. "I think it's better this way, honestly. Cleaner. For both of us." Cleaner, Grace repeated, and felt something hard and unfamiliar rising in her chest to replace the numbness, not yet fury, but its first cousin arriving fast. "Derek, you're accusing me of having an affair with a man who fixed our freezer. That's not clean. That's a lie, and you know it's a lie. Grace. And the house. The diner. You're asking a judge to take away the one thing my mother left me based on a lie you're telling under oath." Her voice cracked finally on the last word, the careful steadiness she'd managed all afternoon beginning at last to give way. "How could you do that? After everything you did for me," Derek finished, his voice suddenly sharper, defensive, in a way that startled her into silence. "I know, Grace. I know what you did. Do you think I don't know? I've spent 2 years feeling like I owe you a debt I can never finish paying off. Every time I walk into that firm, every time someone asks about my wife, I feel it. I can't build a future carrying that weight forever." Grace sat with the phone pressed hard against her ear, the words landing on her with a devastation she had not braced herself adequately for, not the anger of the lawsuit, which she had at least expected, but this, the plain, unguarded confession that her sacrifice, the whole of it, had never been received by her husband as love. It had been received all along as a debt, a weight he had simply grown tired of carrying. "I never wanted it paid back," she said finally, so quietly she wasn't certain he'd heard her. "I did it because I loved you, Derek, not because I was keeping score." "Well, I kept score," Derek said, and the cruelty of the honesty in that sentence seemed even to him to land harder than he'd intended, because he was quiet for a long moment afterward before adding more carefully, "I'm sorry. I don't want this to be ugly. I just need you to sign the papers and let us both move forward." Grace did not answer him again that night. She simply set the phone down gently on the counter of her mother's old desk and sat alone in the small office long after the diner's lights had been switched off, and the last of the evening's regulars had gone home, staring at nothing, trying to understand how a man she had built an entire future for had come somehow to see that future as a debt collector rather than a wife. She did not call Nate that night, though some part of her wanted badly to hear a voice that had never once made her feel like an obligation. She was afraid, if she was honest with herself, of what it would mean to reach for him first in the very week her husband had accused her of exactly that. He heard about the filing 3 days later, not from Grace but from a paralegal at his own company's counsel, who mentioned in passing, reviewing an unrelated matter, that Bennett's Diner's account had come up in a divorce filing, making its way through the county court, a filing that named Hargrove Freight's owner directly as the alleged cause of the marital breakdown. Nate sat very still at his desk when he heard it, the office around him going quiet and distant, The way it had once gone quiet in the cab of his truck reading a name on a search screen he had not spoken aloud in 30 years. He thought of Grace behind the counter of the ledger in the storeroom of a debt to her mother he had spent his entire adult life trying in small and unglamorous ways to repay. And beneath that thought arriving with a force that surprised him. Another feeling. Entirely something fierce and unfamiliar. And entirely without precedent in the careful guarded architecture of his adult life. A protectiveness so immediate and so total that it frightened him, even as he reached for the phone. He did not call Grace that afternoon to declare anything. He called instead the best divorce attorney his general counsel could recommend on short notice, and instructed her in a voice low and steady to take the case whatever it cost, and to bill it quietly entirely to him with strict instructions that Grace Bennett was never under any circumstance to learn where the funds had come from until the matter was fully resolved. Word of the divorce filing moved through the county, the way word always moved through small towns, not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet, persistent way water finds its way through cracks in stone. Dottie heard it first from the clerk at the county courthouse, a cousin of hers who processed filings and mentioned it only in passing, not realizing the name Bennett meant anything to her until Dottie's face had already gone pale. By the following morning, half the regulars at Bennett's diner had heard some version of the story, a version inevitably shaped by whoever had told it last, some closer to the truth than others, though the central fact remained the same. In every telling, Derek Whitmore was divorcing Grace and doing it according to the papers on the grounds that she'd been unfaithful. Grace braced herself in the days that followed for judgment. She had grown up in this town, had watched her mother run the diner through years of gossip and hard luck alike, and understood well enough how quickly a rumor could calcify into accepted fact, once it had circulated a few times through the right mouths. What she had not braced herself for, and what arrived instead, startled her nearly as much as the divorce papers themselves had. Anybody who's spent 5 minutes in this town knows that man's a liar. Dottie announced from her usual booth on the second morning loudly enough that the whole diner could hear it, daring anyone present to contradict her. Grace Bennett has fed half the county on credit and never once asked for more than what she was owed. I've known her mother, and I've known her my whole life, and I'll stand up in whatever courtroom they want me to and say so. It was not only Dottie. Over the following week, one regular after another found their own way of saying the same thing. A retired mill worker who'd eaten free breakfasts through 2 lean winters, offering gruffly to testify to whatever the lawyers needed. A young mother who'd once been quietly slipped extra pancakes for her kids during a stretch, when money had run especially thin, showing up with an envelope of cash. She insisted Grace take toward legal costs. An offer Grace refused 3 times before finally tearfully accepting a smaller amount just to let the woman feel she'd done something. It was not charity exactly, or not only charity. It was, Grace began to understand, as the week wore on, something closer to an accounting finally coming due. 30 years of a diner's quiet generosity, tallied, not in a ledger but in the memory of an entire town, arriving now unbidden, exactly when it was needed most. Nate's attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Patricia Alvarez, arrived at the diner one evening after closing to begin building the case in earnest, spreading files and legal pads across 2 pushed-together tables, while Grace made coffee neither of them would finish. The affair allegation is the weakest part of his petition, Alvarez said, flipping through a folder of preliminary notes. There's no evidence of it because there's nothing to find evidence of. But he's smart enough to know that allegations don't need to be proven to do damage, they only need to be filed. It muddies the waters, makes you look less sympathetic in front of a judge who hasn't met you yet. What do we do about that? Grace asked, exhaustion pressing visibly at the edges of her voice. We build a picture of exactly who you actually are, Alvarez said. Every dollar you put into his education, every late payment you made in good faith, every person in this town willing to stand up and say the same thing Dottie's been saying all week. We let the truth crowd out the lie until there's no room left for it. Grace nodded, though something in the clinical, methodical language of it, building a picture, as though her whole marriage could be reduced to exhibits and affidavits, settled over her with a fresh wave of grief she hadn't fully processed. Until that moment. She excused herself briefly to the kitchen, and it was there alone among the stainless steel and the quiet hum of the newly repaired freezer that Nate found her a short while later, arriving unannounced with a bag of takeout he'd picked up on the drive over some instinct telling him she likely hadn't eaten a full meal in days. You didn't have to bring anything, Grace said, though her voice caught slightly on the words and she did not in fact turn down the food. I know, Nate said, simply setting the bag on the steel counter between them. He did not say more than that at first, letting the silence sit comfortably the way he had learned over the weeks of knowing her, that Grace often needed a moment before words came easily. Finally, watching her push the food around the container without much appetite, he said quietly, "I know this looks like it's about me. The filing. I want you to know, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure it doesn't cost you anything you can't afford to lose." "It's already cost me plenty," Grace said, and there was no bitterness in it directed at him, only a raw, unguarded exhaustion. "I keep trying to understand how 2 years of loving someone turns into this, into strangers arguing over affidavits." Nate did not have an answer for that. He had, after all, asked himself some version of the same question for 6 long years after Vivian, but he stayed with her in the quiet kitchen a while longer, regardless, not offering easy comfort, simply present. And something in that presence alone seemed to steady her more than any reassurance could have. Bo Ferris arrived unannounced the following week, ostensibly to check on a delivery route that ran through the county, though Nate suspected correctly that the real reason had little to do with logistics. He found Nate in the diner's back office going over the invoice for Patricia Alvarez's retainer, with the careful attention of a man determined that no detail be left unaccounted for, and it was there, glancing over the paperwork spread across the desk, that Bo saw the full extent of what his friend had quietly committed to. Not a small favor, not a modest gesture of goodwill toward a valued account, but a fully funded legal defense, anonymous, unconditional, offered without a single stipulation attached to it. "You told her where this money's coming from?" Bo asked, though the question was gentler than it might once have been. "No," Nate said, "and she's not going to hear it from you either." Bo was quiet for a long moment, studying his oldest friend across the cluttered desk. He thought of the conversation in the parking lot months earlier, his own warning about handing himself over to people before he knew whether they deserved it, and something in the memory sat uneasily against what he was seeing now: a man giving fully and without condition to a woman who did not even know the scale of what she'd been given. "This isn't what happened with Vivian," Bo said finally, and it was not a question. "No," Nate said. "It isn't." Bo nodded slowly, and something in his posture eased a tension he had been carrying quietly and protectively for months, finally beginning to loosen. He did not say anything further about it that afternoon, did not offer an apology for the earlier warning, because the warning he still believed had been fair enough at the time. But later that evening, watching through the diner's front window, as Nate helped Grace carry the last of the day's dishes back to the kitchen, laughing quietly at something she'd said, moving through the small, ordinary rhythms of her world as though he'd belonged there far longer than a few months, Bo Ferris found himself for the first time in 6 years, allowing himself to hope cautiously, and with the particular relief of a man who has finally stopped waiting for his best friend's heart to be broken a second time, that this one might actually be different. It was Patricia Alvarez who found at first a discrepancy so small that had she not spent 20 years learning to distrust exactly the kind of tidiness that made a case look too easy, she might have passed over it entirely. She had subpoenaed Derek's financial records as part of routine discovery, expecting little beyond confirmation of what they already suspected: the forged loan, the secret account, the down payment on the new house. But buried within the retainer records of Derek's own divorce attorney was a line item that caught her attention. A substantial portion of the legal fees for Derek's petition had been paid not from Derek's personal accounts, but wired directly from a holding company Alvarez did not recognize, one registered under a name that meant nothing to her at first glance: Crossroads Riverside Development, LLC. "Somebody's bankrolling your husband's divorce," she told Grace over the phone one evening, her voice carrying the particular flatness of a lawyer who has learned to hold her excitement in check until she's certain of what she's found. "And it isn't him." It took another week of careful digging, cross-referencing county filings and business registrations, with the patient thoroughness of someone building a case brick by brick, before the full shape of it emerged. Crossroads Riverside Development held options on nearly every parcel along the stretch of riverfront that included Bennett's Diner, quiet acquisitions made over the better part of 2 years, structured through a chain of shell entities, designed expertly to obscure who actually controlled them. It was only when Alvarez finally traced the paperwork back through a Delaware holding company to its ultimate beneficial owner that she sat back from her desk, stunned into a rare, complete silence. The name on the final filing was Vivian Cross. Nate was in his office in Columbus when Alvarez called to tell him, and for a long moment after she said the name, he did not respond at all. Something in him had known some quiet, unexamined instinct he had refused to give voice to even in the privacy of his own thoughts. A coincidence too vast to fully accept as accidental, sitting for weeks in the back of his mind since the night he'd first learned Grace's married name. But hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud in Alvarez's careful professional voice, landed on him with a force entirely different from suspicion, the specific, sickening vertigo of a wound he had spent 6 years believing fully closed, suddenly reopening deeper and more complicated than it had ever been before. "Explain it to me slowly," he said finally, and Alvarez did. Vivian. It emerged through the weeks of subsequent discovery, had never forgotten the land survey. Nate had shown her the autumn before their wedding, the last fragile document connecting the Hargrove name to a stretch of riverfront property. His father had lost decades earlier to a swindling business partner. She had taken the document with her when she left along with his financial records, not out of any coherent plan at the time, but simply, Alvarez surmised, as the reflexive habit of a woman who never discarded anything that might someday prove useful. It had sat apparently forgotten among her papers for years until a chance conversation at a real estate conference, the same industry, the same circles she had married into, surfaced the county's redevelopment plans for that stretch of to River, and Vivian, recognizing the parcel numbers instantly, had understood exactly what she was holding. She could not approach Nate directly. Whatever calculation she was capable of, even she seemed to understand that door had long since closed. But a young, ambitious attorney at a firm handling zoning work for the development, a man whose family history she had quietly researched and found to her evident interest, threaded improbably back through the very same stretch of Ohio, needed that door remained open. She had cultivated Derek carefully over many months, through intermediaries and colleagues who never suspected the true architecture behind the introductions, planting the seed of the property's value, nudging Alexandra Pierce into his orbit at precisely the moment his marriage had grown vulnerable, funding his legal strategy quietly enough that Derek himself, Alvarez, was now increasingly certain, had no idea whose money was actually financing his own divorce. "He's not the architect of this," Alvarez told Nate. "He's the tool." She built the whole thing around a man too ambitious and too resentful of his own upbringing to ask why an opportunity this convenient had fallen into his lap. Nate sat with the phone pressed against his ear for a long time after the call ended, staring out at the city skyline beyond his office window, without seeing any of it. 6 years of carefully constructed distance, every wall he had built brick by deliberate brick since the morning he'd discovered Vivian's apartment stripped bare, collapsed in the space of a single phone call into something far more devastating than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. The understanding that Vivian had not simply abandoned him and moved on. She had, in some slow, patient, entirely deliberate fashion, been circling back the whole time, waiting for the exact moment when the wound she'd created might be worth reopening for profit. He drove to the diner that same evening, arriving after closing, finding Grace alone in the kitchen, scrubbing down the grill with the same unhurried, exhausted rhythm she brought to everything these days. She saw his face the moment he stepped through the back door and set down her rag, immediately crossing to him with a concern that had somewhere in the preceding weeks become entirely instinctive between them. "What happened?" he told her. All of it. Vivian's name, the shell companies, the land survey he had shown her 30 years' worth of memory ago, the slow, cruel architecture of a scheme that had, without either of them realizing it, been built around the wreckage of his own broken engagement. His voice steady through. Most of it finally cracked on the last part. The understanding that his silence, his 6 years of careful self-protection, had somehow left him vulnerable to exactly the kind of harm he had spent that entire time believing himself immune to. "She used me," he said finally, his voice raw. In a way Grace had never heard from him before, not even in the storeroom the day he'd first told her about Ruth. Not just back then. Now. "She's using what she took from me 30 years ago to hurt you. To take the one thing your mother left you. And I never even suspected." His voice broke fully, and he pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes. A gesture so unguarded, so entirely unlike the composed, careful man Grace had come to know, that something in her chest ached fiercely at the sight of it. Grace did not offer easy reassurance. She simply crossed the last few feet of kitchen tile between them and put her arms around him, holding on with the same steady, unhurried strength she brought to everything, and felt him, after a long moment of rigid resistance, finally allow to himself to lean into it. A man who had spent 6 years, learning never to be held by anyone, letting himself for the first time be held anyway. "She doesn't win this," Grace said quietly into the space between them. "Whatever she thought she was building, she doesn't get to win this." Nate did not answer immediately, but something in the fierce, unshakable certainty of Grace's voice reached the part of him that had gone quiet and guarded 6 years earlier, And for the first time since that autumn he found himself believing, not simply hoping, but believing with a conviction he had not felt safe enough to risk in a very long time that perhaps she was right. The hearing was scheduled for a gray morning in early spring, the kind of pale, uncertain light that seemed to make everyone standing beneath it look a little smaller than they were. Grace arrived early, dressed simply, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as she sat beside Patricia Alvarez at the long table on one side of the courtroom. Across the aisle, Derek sat with his own attorney, his suit pressed, and his expression composed in the practiced, unreadable way Grace had watched him perfect over the years, though she noticed from where she sat a tightness at the corner of his jaw that had not been there in the confident young man who once quizzed himself from law books at her mother's counter. Nate did not sit beside Grace. He had insisted on that beforehand over her objections, understanding better than she did how easily his presence at her table could be twisted into further evidence for an allegation that had never held any truth to begin with. He sat instead several rows back among the town's regulars who had come in a quiet, unbroken procession. Dottie, the retired mill worker, the young mother with the pancake story, a dozen faces Grace had fed and known and never once counted as anything more than neighbors. All of them there that morning simply because 30 years of small kindness had finally come due. Alvarez opened carefully, methodically, laying the foundation before she moved toward the more damaging material: years of receipts, documenting Grace's financial support of Derek's education, testimony from Dottie and the others, confirming a marriage built on genuine sacrifice, rather than the resentful transaction Derek's petition implied. Derek's own attorney pressed hard on the improper closeness allegation, though the questioning grew visibly thinner with each answer. No witness, no evidence, nothing beyond the bare fact of a supplier who had once fixed a broken freezer. It was the financial records that broke the case open. Alvarez laid out methodically, and without visible satisfaction, the paper trail she and her team had assembled: the forged signature on the loan, taken years earlier during Derek's law school days, the funds diverted quietly beyond what Grace had ever knowingly agreed to. And then in a moment the courtroom had not been prepared, for she laid out the second trail entirely: the shell companies, the acquisitions along the riverfront, the true source of the funds that had financed Derek's own legal strategy from the very beginning. "Your Honor," Alvarez said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "the petitioner did not initiate this divorce out of a genuine breakdown of trust. He initiated it as an instrument in a real estate acquisition scheme, financed by a third party, with a pre-existing and entirely unrelated grievance against Mr. Hargrove, a scheme the petitioner appears to have participated in, whether knowingly or not, at the direct expense of his own wife." Derek's composure finally visibly cracked. He turned toward his attorney with a look of genuine bewilderment, and it became clear watching the exchange unfold that Alvarez's earlier read had been correct. He had not fully understood until that morning exactly whose hand had been guiding him. Whatever ambition and resentment had carried him toward the decision to file, he had believed himself until that moment entirely the author of his own choices. Alexandra Pierce sat several rows back, her face draining of color, as the full architecture of the scheme was read into the record. She had believed all those months that she was building something with a man on his way up, not that she was herself. One more piece arranged carefully on a board she'd never been shown in full. She did not wait for the hearing to conclude. She rose quietly midway through Alvarez's closing argument and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. And Derek, watching her go, seemed for the first time to understand fully what he stood to lose that morning, and how much of it had never truly been his to begin with. The judge's ruling when it came later that morning was unambiguous. The allegations of improper conduct were dismissed for lack of any supporting evidence whatsoever. The forged loan and diverted funds were entered formally into the record. Grace was granted full and sole possession of the diner and the property beneath it, along with a financial settlement, reflecting the full extent of what she had contributed, unrecorded and unacknowledged, across the whole of the marriage. Grace did not feel triumphant hearing it. She felt mostly exhausted, the particular hollowed-out exhaustion of someone who has spent months bracing for a blow that has finally landed, only to discover that survival feels less like victory and more like simply still being upright. Outside the courthouse on the wide stone steps overlooking the parking lot, Nate found Vivian Cross waiting. She had come, he understood immediately, not to apologize, but to manage the outcome, the same instinct for careful positioning that had carried her through every room she had ever entered. She looked at him now with an expression that held no shame in it at all, only a kind of brisk, businesslike resignation. "It was never personal, Nathan," she said. "You have to understand that. It was an opportunity. I would have been foolish not to take it." Nate looked at her for a long moment, and something in him, some old careful discipline that had governed every interaction he'd allowed himself for 6 years, finally quietly gave way. "You told me once you loved me," he said, his voice steady, though something beneath it trembled faintly. "I believed you. I built 6 years of my life around not believing anyone again. That wasn't an opportunity you took, Vivian. That was a person. I was a person." Vivian did not answer immediately, and for the briefest moment something flickered across her composed expression. Not quite regret, but something adjacent to it, quickly suppressed. "You landed on your feet," she said finally. "Better than most people ever do." "I did," Nate agreed. "No thanks to you." He turned to leave and then paused, looking back at her one last time with something that was not quite forgiveness but was at last a kind of release. "I hope someday you find something worth more to you than an opportunity. I did. It took me a long time. But I did." He walked down the courthouse steps without waiting for a response, and something in his chest walking away felt lighter than it had in longer than he could easily remember. A door he had kept bolted for 6 years finally quietly swinging, open on its own. Margaret Whitmore found Grace in the courthouse parking lot a short while later, standing alone beside her car, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said finally, her voice smaller than Grace had ever heard it. "More than one, probably. I want you to know where it came from, even if it doesn't excuse it." She told Grace then haltingly, a story she had never told anyone in the family. A small produce stand of her own decades earlier sold off to fund a husband's failed business venture. A man who had left her not long after with nothing but debt and a young son to raise alone. "I watched you build the same thing I built once, and I was terrified of watching you lose it the way I lost mine. So I tried to get you out before it happened. I told myself that was protecting you. I understand now it was only ever about protecting myself from having to remember." Grace listened without interrupting, and when Margaret finished, something in her chest, already worn thin from the morning's proceedings, softened slightly despite everything. She did not offer easy forgiveness. The wound was too fresh, too recently reopened for that. But she reached out and took Margaret's hand briefly, the gesture saying in its quiet way more than either of them was prepared to put into words that morning, that the cycle Margaret had feared repeating had in fact been broken, not by anger but by a truth finally spoken aloud in a courthouse parking lot, between two women who had both in their own ways given everything to men who had not always deserved it. That evening, long after the courthouse had emptied and the gray spring light had softened into dusk, Nate drove out to Bennett's Diner one last time, not as a supplier checking an account, not as a benefactor quietly managing a crisis from behind the scenes, but simply as himself, arriving with nothing to offer except the truth he had spent 6 years too afraid to speak aloud. He found Grace in the kitchen, the diner closed for the night, the old walk-in freezer humming steadily behind her, the same freezer he had once knelt beside in the cold, working alongside Beau Ferris to save it, though it felt now like it belonged to a much earlier chapter of a story neither of them had known they were writing together. She looked up when the bell above the door sounded, and something in her face, tired but unguarded, told him she had been hoping, without quite admitting it to herself, that he would come. "It's over," she said quietly. "All of it. The divorce. The lawsuit. Even she hesitated over the name, even Vivian." "It's over," Nate agreed. He stood for a moment just inside the doorway, and Grace watched something move across his face that she had not seen there before. Not the careful composure he wore in every difficult moment, but something raw, something he seemed for once to be allowing rather than managing. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything back, because I don't think I'll manage it twice." Grace nodded and set down the rag in her hands, and gave him the whole of her attention the way she had once given it to a hungry stranger she'd never met decades before. Either of them had been born into the story that would eventually connect them. He told her then everything he had never said in full to another living person, not Beau, not his board, not anyone. He told her about the boy behind the cannery, about the particular hollowing shame of being called vermin by a man who had never once wondered what circumstances could bring a 16-year-old to a garbage bag in the cold. He told her about Vivian, about the autumn he had believed for the first time in his adult life that the world owed him something good, and about the 6 years afterwards spent building a fortress instead of a life giving freely to strangers, because giving to strangers cost nothing, because a stranger could never get close enough to leave the way she had. "And then I found your mother's ledger," he said, his voice steady but low, "and I understood that everything I'd built, every quiet kindness I told myself was just good business, had actually been an attempt to become the kind of person Ruth Bennett already was, without ever letting anyone become to me what she'd been to a scared kid who had nothing. I didn't come to this diner because of an overdue account, Grace. I came because some part of me recognized something in you before I even understood what it was, and I was terrified of it. I still am a little, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life protecting myself from something that might actually be worth the risk." Grace was quiet for a long moment, tears gathering and finally falling without any attempt on her part to stop them. "I spent 2 years giving everything I had to a man who saw it as a debt," she said, finally her voice thick. "I don't know how to trust that kind of giving again without being afraid of what it costs me." "I'm not asking you to give me anything," Nate said. "I've spent my whole life either taking care of myself or taking care of strangers who never had to see the rest of me. I don't want a debt between us either, Grace. I just want to be known, all the way through, by somebody who isn't keeping score." Something in that sentence, spoken by a man worth more money than Grace could easily imagine standing in a modest kitchen asking only to be seen, undid the last of her hesitation. She crossed the kitchen floor and took his face gently in her hands, and Nate Hargrove, who had once measured a good day by whether he would eat, who had built an empire brick, by careful brick around a wound he'd never let anyone close. Enough to touch. Finally let himself be held by someone who wanted nothing from him at all, except the truth of who he actually was. In the weeks that followed, Nate did something he had told no one, not even Bo, that he intended to do. He had the parcel beneath Bennett's diner formally surveyed and transferred free and clear into Grace's name alone. No conditions, no partnership agreement, nothing that could ever again be leveraged by anyone against her or the diner her mother had built. When Grace protested that it was too much, that she couldn't accept something so enormous, Nate only shook his head. "This land already belonged to somebody who was owed a debt long before either of us were born," he said. "My father lost his family's stake in it to a man who cheated him. Your mother gave a starving stranger a plate of food and asked for nothing back. If this land finally belongs to the person who actually understands what it means to give without keeping score, then it's finally where it should have been all along." Some months later, on a warm evening with the diner freshly reopened under a new coat of paint, Bo Ferris stood beside Nate on the sidewalk outside, watching Grace move behind the counter with the same unhurried rhythm that had first caught Nate's attention a lifetime of grief ago. "I owe you an apology too," Bo said. "I spent months watching you the way you watch a man about to walk off a cliff. Turns out I had it backwards. You weren't walking toward the edge, Nate. You were finally walking towards something solid." "You were right to worry," Nate said. "I'd have said the same thing watching from the outside." "Maybe," Bo said, "but I'm glad I was wrong." There is a particular kind of lesson this story leaves behind, one that has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with what people do with it. Derek Whitmore had every advantage a struggling young man could ask for a wife who believed in him, before he'd given her any real reason, to a mother who loved him fiercely, even when her love curdled into fear, and he traded all of it, piece by piece, for an image he mistook for a future. What he learned too late is a lesson worth carrying with us long after the credits roll. Gratitude is not a debt to be settled and discarded once we've outgrown the people who gave it to us. It is a foundation, and foundations once abandoned tend to bring down everything built on top of them. Nate Hargrove's story teaches something else entirely, that the wounds we carry from poverty, from betrayal, from being disbelieved when it mattered most, do not disappear the moment we become successful. They wait quietly until we are finally brave enough to let someone see them. Healing was never about the money Nate built or the empire he ran. It was about a man finally choosing, after 6 long years, to hand his whole and unguarded self to someone who had never once asked him to prove he was worth it. And Grace Bennett's story reminds us of something simple, something her mother understood long before any of these events unfolded, that kindness given freely without the expectation of return has a way of finding its way back to us, not always from the person we gave it to, but sometimes years later from a stranger standing outside a fogged window in the cold, waiting only to be noticed. If this story moved something in you tonight, we'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness is never wasted, and drop a comment below telling us which moment stayed with you the longest. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story we bring to life together. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next video.